Welcome to this episode of Leaning In with Jessica Lusty and me, Tanya Mikvitz, where we explore the pull between the personal and the collective. In this episode, some of the things we explore are: how can we purposefully navigate these extremely challenging times together, whilst also tending to our own private circumstances and inner worlds? How does our inner work intersect with the outer changes we desire to support? How do we presence our joys, hopes, and dreams alongside the instability, threats, and suffering we and many we care for are experiencing? What does it look like to track ourselves to identify how current circumstances might activate personal and collective woundings? How do personal practices support our capacity to respond to, navigate, and steer narratives towards love-affirming relations? And where does love live in these times? How can it guide us? Hello, everyone. Hi, Jessica. We are back a few weeks since our last episode in the second series, and we're in a better rhythm with coming to you. And it's interesting because last time we dropped in, we were talking about this overall sense of instability and how do we cope with that? How do we as humans kind of just navigate being in an experience which is ever changing, right? The one thing we know, and yet all we want to do is ground ourselves and find the ground. And we often reach for things that are not necessarily healthy or bring us any more sense of rootedness. And we're at this cusp of coming up to a full moon, which is always when we have the sun and the moon in opposing signs. So there is a polarity, and the axis that we're in is the sun is in Aquarius, and Aquarius is overall, in general terms, about the collective. It's a sort of very humanitarian sign. It's the one that also looks at systems and feels into systems and thinks about everybody more so. And then the polar sign or the opposing sign is Leo, where the moon is. And Leo, you could say, is all about the self, but it's about self-expression. It's about artistry, creativity. There is playfulness. There is usually Leos have a lot of charisma. They're like the sun, but Leo is ruled by the sun. So we have this balance, right, between the two, the self and the self-expressing into the collective, and then the responsibility for the collective. So you could say that in the shadow sort of aspects, the Aquarian might be, and also Aquarius is a fixed air sign, so it might be too concerned, too sort of intellectual about everybody and not actually feel very present in the most intimate sort of emotional engagements. Whereas, then the Leo could be totally self-obsessed and just like selfish and want the adoration and accolades and not really think about anybody else. So that would be the sort of shadow sides. So in a world that is so complex, I feel like we're all of us, right, are navigating that axis all the time, because the collective experience and to feel into it truly from a sort of Leo heart um, is challenging, because there is so much suffering, there is so much pain, there is so much conflict going on all the time. And then at the same end, we have a lot of strategies and a lot of possibility to distract ourselves with the most immediate personal experience, right? And just sort of cocoon ourselves into that. And then at the same time, what we're longing for, of course, is the connection, which brings us out into the collective. So there is, there's some interesting things weaving between these two signs, or that in these two signs really sort of um, symbolize, I think, what a lot of the pulls and the pushes of right now are. How are you within this axis, Jessica?
Mm, thank you, Tanya, for that. I feel this in such a real way so often in the last, week or two. And before and beyond that, but really in the immediacy of this moment, um, sort of being kind of stuck in the middle and feeling the push and pull of that, even in just my interactions with friends and colleagues and people I'm in relationship with, because the simple question of how are you is, I can find myself sort of like kind of feeling trapped between those two poles, because in one moment I might feel inclined just naturally, because of the immediacy of like the last 15 minutes, 10 minutes, half hour of my day or night, to speak from what's going on with, think about Leo ruled by the sun, the center of the universe, right? How am I from the center of my immediate life, myself, my family, my most immediate engagements? And on that side of things, if I'm feeling a sense of playfulness or joy or possibility, and I begin to presence that, then all of a sudden I can feel, depending on who I'm with, and they may be bringing in that immediacy of the moment their deep concern about what's going on, the impact that is happening to them, to immediate friends and family, which I'm also moving in and through and with, right? But not always at the same time as the person I'm in an encounter with, right? I'm not in the same psychic place, right? So it's like that, how we're moving with this. And then I can feel a sense of like self-consciousness, sort of like, oh, um, should I be presencing something that feels so central to myself and might carry a tone or an energy that is discordant with what I feel when I feel into the collective. And then for me, that second leap is, and this is something I'm really trying to do in my newsletter and here, is also recognizing that if I step into and get immediately influenced, right? And Aquarius, and that sign, an air sign, right, has to do with information, like what's in the collective zeitgeist, right? What is the mainstream media weaving and telling us, and how is it spinning? What is happening, right? What is happening from the center of the US government right now under the new Trump administration? What's happening in the Middle East, with respect to the Palestinian and Israeli question and conflict, and these places in our lives where we're really feeling um, that things are at a crux, at a critical point, at a point of breakdown, at a point of total, questioning everything and disruption and instability, and that the immediate kind of messaging about that in the mainstream has a very negative doomsday, um what's wrong, everything that's wrong with what's happening. And I know that for myself, it's like it is a practice of resistance and a practice of resilience and a practice of um revolution, in to be like, there are other pieces, there are other interpretations, there are other perspectives, there are communities who are gathering in the spirit of taking this moment of instability to assert something different, right? And yeah, so it's like I'm experiencing that piece for myself of feeling sometimes kind of caught in, and having to pull myself forward to ground myself, not in a sense of stability, but in a sense of what what am I going to move with, in terms of all the things, the currents that are moving right now. Does that make sense? So when you ask that question, that's sort of what, what really comes up for me, and how to weave both in that, the personal and the collective, and the tension between them, that generative and potential, the space of most potential being kind of like where they meet, and I don't want to say balance because it's a reciprocation that's not always, it's not always in perfect balance, but it kind of comes and goes and ebbs and flows.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think it comes back to this thing of um, you know, are we wanting to create change, right? So, and how do we do that most effectively? What is going to help us to then create something different if we are, as we prefaced in our first series, that uh, the conversation that we're in here is that we recognize that the systems that we live in are toxic and oppressive and faulty and need change, right? And that's what we're hoping to, in our own little grassroots kind of way, be in the conversations that begin to shift into real change, and be with the complexity, right? Which is also, it's another thing that is really difficult for us humans. We want the simple, straightforward answers that we can hold on to, and I think here it's a similar thing. We touched on it in our last episode. This thing of like, are we bypassing, right? Is one thing, and kind of going, oh well, but everybody's feeling it, and it's just terrible, and then there's a sort of acceptance which doesn't give energy, and it doesn't do anything, right? So we just shrug our shoulders and we go, well, it's all terrible, right? And it is, but that's not really helpful. So what are the things that will help us to still move through? And because if we give up, like if we just listen to this doomsday narrative, then in a way that's also a way of kind of going, well, it doesn't matter what I do, I might as well stop recycling or whatever. We're all going, the planet's going to be dead in 5 years time or whatever. So if that is what we choose not to believe, and we have hope, then what is going to help our hope? Not in a way to negate what's happening, but to maybe offer alternatives to what's happening or what will happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that that's definitely um yeah, the place that I'm living in and within and from, and observing and wanting to continue to enter in to every conversation and every opportunity that I have to engage in a way that sort of, this is, such a, I forget where it was coming from recently, but it was the echo of, in this very, I mean, this is we're in a perennial kind of crisis, is a perennial, phenomenon of human created history on this planet, right? And so the call to stay awake, right? The call to stay awake, right? How do I keep myself awake in every moment so that I'm not pulled into these, very powerful undercurrents, and carried right within that, and like to stay awake and able to say, okay, I'm stepping into this, book group gathering, and noticing the conversation, absolutely gaining this momentum around um, us versus them, doomsday, all of that, and the emotion is getting whipped up in a way that you can tell, um, it might be coming towards some sort of like, camaraderie and catharsis, but it's not going to, it's gonna stop before it gets there. And it's just going to accentuate the negative feelings, the doomsday feelings, the fearful feelings, the inevitability that you're pointing to, right? This kind of sense of inevitability, and it being more than any one of us or any group of us can um can move in a different direction and then we all leave. And it's um how do I uh engage in spaces and places and conversations in a way that can really hold this question around how can we utilize this moment um, for ourselves and for our collective in order to create the changes that we are all longing for. I mean, because that is the thing that the Trump administration has brought is change, right? I mean, massive scale change, not in a way that many of the people that I'm in conversation with would want to see it happen. And yet, what does it ask of us? What opportunity, right, does it create? And kind of coming on the back of what we were last time talking about, this instability, and when things start to shake up, um, how do we come into relationship with that in a way, whether it's personal circumstances or the collective, that allows us to utilize that energy to create what it is, that the visions that we hold and hope for, the change that we've really been longing for.
Yeah. I don't know.
Well,
But
I
we
think
asking the question, I think that's also the thing, is it's like we might not have, it's not about knowing the answers, but staying with the question of what is this moment calling forth in me, and how can I best respond, and what can I bring to it, how are we meeting that immediate challenge. And there's a lot of conflict, and how do we enter that conflict.
yeah, and I think for me the biggest question is back to the practices of how can we, you know, if we think about like what the colonial, right, this is a term that's used a lot, the colonizers mindset, the Western mindset, the colonial mindset, there is that, the urgency, the sense of urgency, right, is a piece of that. A momentum, to stop, to pause, to reflect, to feel in, to listen deeply. All those things are antithetical, right, to that way of being. And so for me, it's when I know in my own experience that when I feel under threat, and there was a moment last week where I really recognized that what was going on with respect to Trump's policies, and and so many people are reminding us this is the strategy, to create chaos, to create confusion, to overwhelm. So like recognize that, and when you start noticing those things, really attend to them, because if you get whipped up into that, we are absolutely playing into the hand of the people who would like to drive the change in the direction that in the vision that they've laid out, right? And the same thing happens in our personal lives. And I had this moment last week where I really recognized, it was like a flashback to a time in our lives where someone that we were intimately involved with was pursuing a very clear, and driving towards a very clear objective that felt similarly threatening as what's happening right now. Like I recognized there was this feeling of being under threat, like literally, and feeling overwhelmed and powerless, and like that someone else who I would describe as, you know, unwell, like in the way that they're thinking, and is psychically unwell, and what they're driving towards, is coming from that place. Um, that I am being pulled along, and I can't, I don't, I'm helpless, I'm hapless, right, in this. And it was just in recognizing that then it was like when we talk about with the shadow work, is to then recognize the confluence, right, of this earlier wounding and the conditioning I have, around my own agency, and to remind myself, where does my agency lie? It lies in my capacity to really be with myself in a supportive way, to bring the tools to bear so that in a moment like that, where an immediate experience that's a collective in nature, even is sort of grabbing onto and tapping into the emotional charge, the psychic charge of a very personal dynamic. And there's an opportunity there for like healing and finding my psychic footing, my spiritual footing, to say, okay, I can now recognize and come into a greater sense of maturity, sovereignty, more healed place to recognize the agency that I have and to exercise it, right? Um, yeah, so I mean, for me, those are the places within this that I feel like and going back to that one setting, like if you're entering into kind of a social setting where you feel, right? You feel the group dynamic spinning into these the perpetuation of the overwhelm, the haplessness, the helplessness, and then that for you or for me as a person to what does it mean to slow something like that down, to ask a group to pause, whether it's a direct request or whether it's a subtle request, or but to just exercise the agency, right, in those moments to question um kind of the standard momentum of the group dynamic, and invite something different. That can feel very risky. I have so many people I'm in relationship with, and myself included, that have had some really very deeply wounding moments around expressing themselves, expressing their power, asserting, right, within a group dynamic that can go back to very young years, right, where you bring something and everyone in the group kind of looks at you, and there's a social sanctioning, right, that can happen, right? It's these kinds of things that I feel like I am wanting to nourish and nurture within all of us, through this work that we do here, and within the context of like the journey that you're running, so that we can show up, in ways that can call some of this into question, and not in a way that shames or, wounds others, right? But that invites an opening, right? Invites something different.
I think I wanted to sort of track back to a couple of um, things that you mentioned there, because I think it's like there's two quite key things to be that are really helpful to become aware of. And one is this, when you were speaking to, like the energy of the moment. And there is the collective energy, and this, like you're saying, there's a stirring up, there's fast change, there's chaotic, this kind of energy. And that's sort of similar if in a personal relationship, if somebody comes at you and they're really angry with you, and you think it's really unfair, you're being attacked, and you rise up and you meet them from the same place, and all you end up doing is being stuck in that place, right? There is no going forward, you're locked in, right? And that's where this, as you suggested, like, take a moment, pause. The way that you can enter into a different dynamic is only if you don't respond at the same level of energy, right? Now that takes a lot, right? We know, like, it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of self-awareness to not be pulled, particularly if you feel like in any way that, like unjust or, attacked, or all those things. You need to protect yourself, you need to stand up for yourself. Those are the immediate responses, but actually, on some level, that that's not going to, the other person can't hear you anyway, right? If somebody's already revved up, it doesn't matter what you say because they're not listening. And so what do you do? So you come into a place where you can have a conflict, but a conflict where you're actually trying to come to common ground. It's not a power struggle, right? So you have to stay up, step, you have to create the shift, which is that pause, and then you might come in, in a different, very totally different way, and refuse to get engaged in that energy, and then something different can happen. So like that's one thing about this, like the shifting the response, taking a pause, taking a moment, and sort of saying, no, we need to stop here and breathe, whatever it is. And this is why we have all the mindfulness practices, meditation practices, breathing practices. We create more space and opportunity for that, even within, well, to begin with, within ourselves. And then the second piece that you spoke to is, having taken the pause to also recognize what is deeply personal to you that is stirring. What does this kind of chaos or this kind of aggravation or this kind of judgment, or what comes up in you? Is there a personal story which is going to kind of pull you into it from a, like, can you tend to that inside yourself, right, and know what's happening there before you respond, so you can respond from a more whole way, a more mature way, and a more direct way to what's actually happening in the now. And that's, I feel like that's what accountability is, right? That um, we take responsibility for our own story. We take the responsibility for what's happening in the moment, in terms of, okay, so even if I'm in response, I'm still bringing something to it, and it's my responsibility then to be, what is it you always say, response able, in a more mature, whole, discerning kind of way, to look at, to be able to step up out. That's a bit of that Aquarius energy, to sort of be able to step out and view the fuller picture of, like, if I tend to this issue in this kind of way, if I keep whipping up the frenzy, and there's something good there, and it's good about being, having, like, also the collective, like if you have a group energy and we're all riled up and we're all angry, but where does it actually take us, and maybe there are some ways that we can get rid of the anger, or not get rid of, but let it move, right, let it move through in some way, so that then it becomes productive, and it actually becomes a change making kind of anger, for instance.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that our whatever the personal piece is, we attend to it so it doesn't reinforce the panic, the helplessness, that the things that keep us in that activated reactive state, rather than the response able state. um yeah. And it can happen too, right? We can be at odds with ourselves. There's so many different ways that, um, it's like I always think within us, between us, and among us, right? It's like what's happening within me, what's happening between you and I, and then what's happening among us. And like, the capacity to look at whatever we're experiencing through those three lenses, and really be thoughtful and caring about what we can see, what we can't see, um and what's presenting itself for our for us to be attended to, and there's always something there that can really support, I think, the healing and the transformation towards more beautiful relations within us, more care, more love between us, and among us. Yeah.
Yeah, how do we love better? I mean, that feels also sort of topical as we're coming up to Valentine's Day, which I have to say, I always feel like, oh my gosh, all it seems to bring is like consumerism to the to the fore, and actually in some ways um, quite a distorted sort of idea of love as being, only in this romantic love and partnership. And I always, and also the expectation of what that is. I used to, many years ago, work in catering, and I remember like working on Valentine's Day, serving tables was like a total nightmare because you just had the restaurant filled with tables of two, which is harder work. But it was more about like, it made me sad because I was observing all these couples and this kind of like the expectation of one day to be a certain thing, and holds that, it was felt, when I look at it now or feel into it now, so totally opposite of the beauty of what love in all its ways can, really bring forwards, when it's allowed to flow. And but I feel in this moment, it really is like, how do we keep our hearts open, and not turn away from offering love forwards in being of service to each other still. And I think we need to really resource ourselves in the places where we feel the love flow and where we can allow it to flow, and where we can build the kind of community relationships, in various, the more informal communities of our, friendship groups or families and networks, or the more sort of formal, open gatherings, that we really need this as a resource where we can feel the connection. Because I feel, that's love, is like being, really with care, in deep connection with each other, and holding the understanding that, if it's happening to one of us, it's happening to all of us. But that means that equally, if we lift each other up, and, not in a bypassing way, but in a way where we can care for each other deeply amidst the challenges, um, we are creating change, because it's not the dominant narrative.
Absolutely. And, I think to be affirming of the fact that, thinking about, so much was coming to me, when you were sharing there, and that absolutely, I think right now, with all of the attempts to undo the instruments and the programs and the initiatives and efforts that have been put into place in the US society, right, in the last, you know, decade or so, plus, obviously whole groups of people, right, moving and social movements towards this for decades and decades. But the real kind of like bringing it into institutions in the form of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in the form of, centering the perspectives on US history, and on, the experiences of all people who live here, and those who live here, and whose ancestors have lived here for millennia, right? To to bring all of that to the fore in a way that, to me, is like, it's the move towards love. It's the presence of love to do that. It is the recognition of the the lovability, the inherent, the inherent exchange of love and reverence and respect and honoring, towards all beings, and towards land, and towards all of the things, right? I mean, you feel that movement has been gaining, institutional foothold, in ways that feel so important to so many of us. And to have that be kind of, the unraveling, the retroactive punishment that's underway, right, towards those things, people engaging and enacting in that. And that, to me, it's like the recognition, it goes back to this essential piece of, are we lovable? Can't, is who I am, however I show up, whatever, wherever I fall on the spectrum of, you name it, right? All the different things. Um, am I lovable in the eyes of myself, in the eyes of the between us, and in the eyes of the among us, right? All the laws and the which is really where love is codified publicly or denied, right? Publicly. Um, and so it's like I would love to see this broadening of love, because I think that I really, my sense of it, my visceral sense of it is that it's so, like going back to, oh gosh, I should look up the reference, and I'll put it in the episode notes, of who coined that phrase. The personal is the collective is the personal, the political is the personal. But really, that deep, deep sense of, you know, the the expression of love. And it goes into that romantic notion of the proscriptions and the prescriptions, right? Love looks like this, love does this, love behaves in this way, and obviously, when I say I'm separating that out, I mean like these sort of like proscriptive and prescriptive, what would be the right word, where it's not like it's all the layers on top. It's like lost that essence of the fundamental deep down of bringing true reverence, respect, curiosity, like wonder, right? To whomever, whatever we're encountering, that
Mm.
is the lens of love, right? And through that, the way we speak to each other, the behavior, all of it, you know what I mean? It unfolds in a way that is expressive, right? Of love and its inherentness, versus, right, the idea of this kind of femininity or masculinity or whatever, is lovable, right? This is what is the most desirable. And, so many efforts in whatever way it is, or, to be whatever, like all of those notions of what makes someone lovable or not lovable from a particular standpoint, is, I just think, yeah, that is where I would love this Valentine's conversation to kind of open up, right?
Yeah, and that the loving is the act, that love is like something, it's an action as opposed to um that it has the object. you know so I was just thinking of those bracelets you said, but what would love do, like what would love do in this instance? And the yeah, like I love what you said, like the curiosity of, because I think there is the idea, the a lot of the sort of the very, which is a very modern notion, right? Romantic love. That there are certain, it looks a certain way, as opposed to what does it feel like, right? And
And what does it bring forward in us? What does
yeah.
it open in us? What does it elicit from us,
Hmm. And this idea that it's not, it's sort of, it exists, and it open, we open to it, that there is, it's the fundamental thing, that if we open to it, and it's generative, and there isn't a sense of, like where does it come from, this idea that if I show you love, I have less for another person, but that it's, that it's generate, the more that we open to it, the more of it there is to experience for all of us. So um yeah.
Yeah, and how do we heal? Like, when I even in this conversation, some of the things I'm saying, I can hear inside of my head where it's like, oh, well, if you take it this far, if you take it that far, or well, what about this? Are you leaving this out? And eh, there's so much, there is such a need. There is such a profound need for the expression of this kind of love that is, it's both deeply tender and vulnerable and also intensely courageous and fierce. Love doesn't only say yes, love says no, right? Love expresses in all of these varieties of ways. Right, but to the end of, I think that sense of well-being and respect and reverence and regard for all of us in all of our variety of forms and expressions, right? Um, and to be able to stand for that and assert that in a world where you mentioned the word accountability earlier, and it's like, you know, I was listening to something the other day, Pachamama Alliance call, and there was this, he was a Martin Luther King Jr. scholar. I'll put this in the notes too. I'm forgetting his name, Drew. And he, read a really amazing poem that he wrote in response to this moment. Um, and he's like, I always go back to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. because, he knew he could bring, he could, his calls for reconciliation and the recognition that there is no reconciliation without accountability, but it's not punitive, right? The accountability is loving. It's not we're not looking to punish. We're looking to heal. We're looking to bring what is life-giving and engenders the flourishing of all of us, right? And if we can enter into that, and I think the capacity to presence love in in the context of deep wounding and in the context of, things we're all carrying that are sore and tender, is, it's a real art and devotion. And like you said, it's a practice, right? So again, that's what, how do we practice that for ourselves, with ourselves? And then, it's like the concentric circles going out, right? And then in our most immediate, and in our communities, and, in what we envision as possible, and what we find ways to assert forward, more broadly, um
This is exactly also about the the capacity, building the capacity to turn to all those parts within ourselves, and kind of go, how can I, forgive and love my past self who made choices, for instance, that, were painful choices, or I now might see as regrets, or how can I, what are the parts of me that I'm denying, how can I turn towards that? Because so often what we find hard to love in somebody else, or what we see in the world, has to do with the parts of ourselves that we cannot accept, or been told, we have so much programming. So this work of delving into really an exploration and excavation of what sits in our subconscious as the messaging that is then forming our incapacity to move forwards in a more loving way. We have to turn in to be able to embrace the out, and where we're rubbing up against, discomfort in sort of more immediate relationships, or even not so immediate, like those are the places to look. What is it that is stopping me here from being in a more generous, open, loving relationship with this? What is it inside of me, and how can I shift that so I can bring love forwards? And it sounds so simple, and it's really not. But it's I always find that when I am sitting in the presence of people who are willing to do that, that is where I feel I deeply feel the hope for all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Mm. So on that note,
I'm feeling like there's a little piece that's wanting to sort of presence here around that. If you're willing, are you willing to drop in for a little guidance?
yes, how can I how can I say no?
Let's do it. And this is obviously an invitation for all of us who might be listening to this at any time, and whatever's stirring with you, if you're in a safe place to do it, or you can pull over or pause and pick this back up when you can kind of drop in and be in this inquiry a little bit. You can sort of follow along and track your own responses to to where the guidance follows here with Tanya. So just take a moment, Tanya, and just let your belly soften a little bit, kind of belly opening up. Yeah, just noticing like you just lean back a little, or just let yourself be open to what's stirring, what's arising in this moment through this conversation and this theme on love. Such a big word. And I'm just going to offer a few sentence stems, and you can just complete them with whatever comes to mind or comes across your vision, physical sensations, even. What I'm noticing as I hold this question of how love lives in me and how it extends out possibilities and the limitations. What I'm noticing right now is
I'm feeling this pulsation around my heart center, but quite wide, quite big, almost like sort of ripples or petals, and a kind of permeable and pulsing sort of movements. It feels quite expansive.
but just being with that, allowing that noticer within you, the awareness to maybe move with that, move in it, maybe to the center of it, around it, following it out into that expansive expression. What I'm noticing as I create a little more space and a little more awareness to this sensation is
But as I allow space, there is just an opening, an unfolding, which is, I know, is often contracted and held back. That I need the pause to expand into it. And I do feel that sense of like, oh, if I lean back, it allows me to open.
so just allow yourself to do that, whether it's literally physically or even just sort of like as an inner posture, energetic posture, just to kind of let yourself lean back and follow that inclination. What I'm noticing as I sort of allow myself to lean further back into this is
I feel much bigger than my body. I feel much more connected. And I feel a softening in my heart space. And I feel a sense of timelessness too.
so just taking a few breaths there and just inviting you to place right there at the center of this spaciousness, at the center of this timelessness in your heart, this opening. Just placing anything that is tender in you, that is any parts of you, like you mentioned earlier, that we all carry, where we question our lovability. And maybe you can feel a younger version of yourself, or just bringing whatever kind of comes up spontaneously in this moment. What in me needs to be able to open, to expand, to feel this sense of being able to lean back and let open. What in me needs this quality of love, attention, and care to be nourished by this. Just in your own mind, eye, anything that comes to you, just placing it there like you would an offering to love. What I'm noticing as I make whatever offerings have come to mind into this space in my heart is
A lot of tenderness, but also a sense that I have the space to hold a space that is bigger, more expansive than my more smaller parts.
yeah.
It's like I feel in this space that I can hold, I can welcome all the different parts that are alive in me. Like I feel the container.
So just taking a few more breaths and just leaning back and just allowing, whatever is coming up in this moment with that tenderness, with that sense of this sort of greater holding within you that has more capacity, more expansiveness, more possibility, and what feels more limited at times. And just taking a few breaths, and as you kind of come back slowly, just see as you kind of, it's like almost like you're gaining distance, you're able to still feel and see in this expansive center of your heart, those pieces that came forward, and you're trusting, as you kind of recede from having your awareness focus so much on that, but you kind of know it's there. It's sort of like running in the background. That part of you is receiving these pieces that can benefit from love and care. And then in your own way, just allowing your awareness to come back to the space that you're in, to this screen that we're on, virtual space we're sharing between your little home in London town, my little home in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Jessica, for that guidance.
You're welcome.
And thank you all for being here. I hope that either through maybe even being with me on this beautiful journey that Jessica guided, or just maybe bearing witness to it, offered a sort of sense, either a remembrance of how taking that pause that we were talking about earlier, you know, doesn't it doesn't actually require a lot of time and space, right? And the more familiar we become with it, so that we can be more discerning and more accountable in our own responsiveness when things come our way, as they continuously do.
Yeah.
um, and that also, that we can do it for ourselves, we can do it with each other in this way, so maybe next time that you're sat with a friend and they're going into big stories, which you will bear witness to, and that, but maybe offering also just a moment of breathing and being, and how a shift and an ability to hold what's happening can arise in different ways too, in these kinds of ways of just presencing what is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tanya, for being here with me and always, investing with me into this place of practice, this, creating communities of practice, creating friendships that include practicing um, the things that can support us. I really appreciate that so much. And we're with leaning in, as we've said before, this is a space that we really intend towards bringing people in more. We've had a few opportunities for that so far, and we'll be creating more. So stay tuned if you want to drop in with us to practice together. And please let us know. You obviously can reach out through the Leaning In portal on Instagram, through either of our personal websites, TanyaMickwitz.com and Jessica Evolving Mindfully, to see ways to connect. Tanya has some really beautiful programs running right now that bring all of these pieces together that we're working with on leaning in with women, primarily women right now, but I think it's open to all expressions of humanness. And yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So we offer it forward with a whole lot of love. May we continue to let love guide us.
Blessed be. We appreciate your presence in this space. If you sense that friends, family, or peers would benefit from leaning in, please share.
If an episode speaks to you in a particularly meaningful way, or raises questions that you would like to share with us, we would love to hear from you. You can connect with us here on Spotify, YouTube, and Instagram at at leaning_in_.
Leaning In is produced by Tanya Mikwitz and Jessica Lusty. The beautiful music you hear here is provided by Masood Ali Khan. Our sound engineer is Marley Mikwitz Montgomery.